Casimir Draven woke to the scent of rain-soaked wildflowers and the terrifying realization that he was not alone. His skull ached. His mouth tasted of burnt wine and regret. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been wrung out and hung to dry. But none of that mattered, because there was a woman pressed against his chest, her dark hair spilling across his bare arm, her breathing slow and peaceful against his collarbone. He did not remember falling asleep. He did not remember this room, and he most certainly did not remember inviting anyone into his bed. Casimir turned his head slowly, his heart already climbing into his throat, and looked down at the woman curled against him. His blood turned to ice. Elwyn Kale, Queen of Dusk Hollow, ruler of the Eastern Wolf Territories, the woman who had publicly called him a butcher at last year's summit and thrown wine in the face of his ambassador. The woman whose kingdom had been a thorn in Valtheris's side for 3 generations. The woman he considered, without exaggeration, the single most infuriating person alive. She was asleep on his chest, one hand resting over his heart, wearing nothing but a thin linen shift that was not hers, and he was wearing even less. Casimir stopped breathing. His mind, usually sharp enough to cut glass, produced exactly one coherent thought. This cannot be happening. He tried to piece together the previous night. The festival feast. The long table beneath the stars. The way she had looked in the firelight, dangerous and beautiful, and absolutely off limits. Had they spoken? They must have. They always did, even when the speaking was just sharpened words disguised as diplomacy. But he couldn't remember the conversation, couldn't remember anything past the wine and the music and the strange, pulling sensation that had tugged at something behind his ribs as the night deepened. He looked around the room, searching for an explanation. Stone walls, a hearth still smoldering with last night's fire, a window showing pale gray sky over unfamiliar trees, a wooden table overturned near the door, 2 goblets on the floor beside it, dark wine staining the stone like old blood. His shirt hung from the back of a chair. Her gown, deep green and embroidered with the silver stag of Dusk Hollow, was pooled on the floor near the foot of the bed like a shed skin. Her crown sat on the windowsill, catching the thin morning light, and his signet ring, the one bearing the iron wolf of Valtheris that had been on his right hand for 9 years, was on her finger. His signet ring. On her finger. The room lurched. Casimir's mind cycled through explanations at a speed that bordered on panic. Drugged wine, a prank, a political trap engineered by one of a dozen enemies who would love nothing more than to see the king of Valtheris compromised. But none of those explanations accounted for the way his arm was draped around her waist, or the way she fit against him like she'd been sleeping there for years, or the small, devastating detail that he had apparently removed his own ring and placed it on her hand. Casimir's gaze snapped back to the woman sleeping against him, and the motion must have disturbed her, because Elowyn stirred. She made a soft sound, a small hum of contentment, and pressed closer. Her fingers curled against his chest, then her eyes opened. For exactly 2 seconds, she looked up at him with an expression so unguarded, so warm and sleep-softened, that something in his ribcage did something it had absolutely no business doing. Then recognition hit. Her eyes went wide. The color drained from her face so fast it was almost impressive. She scrambled backward with a sound that fell somewhere between a gasp and a shriek, tangled in the sheets, and nearly fell off the bed entirely. Casimir caught her arm on instinct. She wrenched free like his hand was made of hot iron. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice pitched high with panic. "What did I do?" Casimir shot back, sitting up. "You were sleeping on me. I would never willingly sleep on you," Elowyn hissed, pulling the sheet up to her chin as if it could undo whatever had already happened. "Where are we? What is this place?" "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean I don't remember," Casimir said, his jaw tight. "I remember the feast. I remember the toasts. I remember you insulting my border policy in front of the entire Ashenmere delegation, and after that, nothing." He remembered more than that, in fragments. The Ashenmere festival in full roar, lanterns strung between ancient oaks, their reflections shimmering on the surface of the Great Lake like fallen stars. Hundreds of wolves from every territory gathered under the open sky, the air thick with wood smoke and roasting meat, and the dangerous undercurrent of too many rivals pretending to be friends. Music from the lakeside pavilion, the drums that the northern packs played until the ground itself seemed to pulse. He remembered Elowen across the feasting table, firelight playing over her face as she laughed at something Marin said, the sound carrying across the noise of the crowd and landing in his chest like an arrow he hadn't seen coming. He remembered the way her eyes had met his for a beat too long before she looked away. He remembered the sharpness of her tongue during the diplomatic toast, the way she had raised her goblet and wished Valtheris continued prosperity in all its humble endeavors, and the way the word humble had been aimed directly at him like a blade wrapped in silk. He remembered his own retort, something about Dusk Hollow's admirable commitment to tradition in an era that demanded progress, and the flash of fury in her eyes that had made something in him burn. He remembered the third toast, the fifth, the wine that kept flowing, and then the world dissolving into darkness like ink dropped into water. Elowen stared at him, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. Her eyes darted across the room, cataloging the same details he had already noticed. The overturned table, the spilled wine, the clothes on the floor, his ring on her finger. She looked down at her hand and went absolutely still. "Take it off," Casimir said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. She pulled the ring free and threw it at him. It bounced off his chest and landed on the mattress between them. They stared at each other in the thin morning light, two of the most powerful wolves on the continent, sitting half-dressed in a room neither recognized, and neither of them had the faintest idea what had happened. Then Elowen's gaze dropped to his left wrist, and her expression changed. "What is that?" she whispered. Casimir looked down. A mark had appeared on the inside of his wrist. Dark lines etched into the skin like a tattoo, forming a pattern he had never seen before. Interlocking circles bound by a single, unbroken line. It looked ancient, it looked deliberate, and it had not been there yesterday. Elowen raised her own wrist slowly, her hand trembling. The same mark, identical, perfectly mirrored. The room was very quiet. "That's not possible," Elowen breathed. A knock thundered against the door. Both of them flinched. "Your Majesty?" came a muffled voice from the corridor. "Orin, Casimir's beta. Your Majesty, the Dusk Hollow delegation is threatening to march if their queen is not presented within the hour. Are you in there?" Casimir and Elowen locked eyes across the bed. Political catastrophe hung in the air between them, thick enough to choke on. "Do not," Elowen whispered fiercely. "Let him in." Another knock, sharper this time. "Sire, I can hear you breathing. Open the door." Casimir pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and tried very hard not to think about the fact that the marks on their wrists had begun to glow. They separated. It took 17 minutes of whispered, furious negotiation and one window exit that Elowen would later deny ever making. She dropped from the first-floor ledge into a hedge, retrieved her gown through the window Casimir passed it through, and was halfway across the courtyard before Orin finally lost patience and shouldered the door open. The beta found Casimir sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, looking like a man who had not slept at all rather than one who had apparently slept far too well. "Where have you been?" Orin asked, his careful composure barely hiding the alarm underneath. "The Ashenmere stewards have been searching for you since dawn. The Dusk Hollow retinue is convinced we've kidnapped their queen." "I was walking," Casimir said flatly. Orin looked at the overturned table, the stained floor, the two goblets, the bed, still warm and unmistakably slept in by more than one person. His gaze came back to Casimir with the expression of a man choosing his next words very carefully. "Walking," the beta repeated. "Alone," Casimir added. Orin said nothing for a long moment, then he straightened. "You should know that Queen Elowen was also missing from her chambers last night. Her second, Marin Solvik, has been tearing the estate apart." "Coincidence," Casimir said without conviction. The beta's jaw tightened. "Sire, your wrist." Casimir looked down. The sleeve of his shirt had ridden up, exposing the edge of the mark. The dark lines against his skin were unmistakable, even in the pale morning light. "What is that?" Orin asked quietly. "I don't know." The Ashen Mirror Accord had been sacred neutral ground for over 200 years. Every midsummer, the Wolf Kingdoms sent their leaders to the ancient lakeside estate to renew the truce, settle trade disputes, and pretend they didn't despise each other. The festival lasted 3 days and nights. Wine flowed, oaths were sworn, and for those 3 days, enemies sat at the same table without drawing blood. Casimir and Elowin had attended every accord since ascending their respective thrones, and every year the experience was the same: cold civility across the feasting table, barbed pleasantries that drew no actual blood but left bruises, a mutual, unspoken agreement to endure each other's presence for the sake of their people, and nothing more. Last night's festival feast should have been no different, but somewhere between the third toast and the midnight hour, both of their memories went dark. Across the estate, Elowin was having a remarkably similar conversation with Marin, and it was going no better. "You vanished," Marin said, her voice low and dangerous. "For 7 hours, Elowin. Your guard checked your room at midnight. Empty. I've had scouts combing the estate since the festival fires went out." "I went for a walk," Elowin said, sitting very straight in her chair and ignoring the pounding behind her eyes. "In your shift? I changed first. Your gown was not in your room. I took it with me." Marin stared at her queen with the flat, unamused expression of a woman who had been lied to by professionals and did not appreciate amateurs attempting the same. "Show me your wrist," Marin said. Elowin's hand curled into a fist beneath the table. "Why?" "Because one of the kitchen staff saw you crossing the courtyard at dawn, climbing out of a hedge, clutching your gown against your body, and she said there was something on your arm, something glowing." Silence stretched between them, taut and brittle. Elowin slowly extended her arm and pulled back her sleeve. Marin leaned forward, her face went pale. "That's a soul bond sigil," the second whispered. "A what?" Marin was already on her feet. "Don't move. Don't leave this room. Don't speak to anyone." She paused at the door, a new and terrible thought crossing her face. "Who were you with last night?" Elowin said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Marin closed her eyes. "Tell me it wasn't him." When Elowin still didn't respond, Marin swore under her breath and left the room at speed. Within the hour, a healer was summoned. Not the estate's resident physician, who dealt in broken bones and stomach ailments, but a woman named Thyra Voss who had been living quietly in the lake village for decades and who, according to Marin, knew things about old magic that most wolves had forgotten. They brought Casimir and Elowin into the same room for the examination. It was the first time they had been face to face since the morning's chaos, and the tension was suffocating. Neither had changed clothes. Elowin's hair was still tangled from sleep, and a leaf from the hedge clung to the back of her gown. Casimir had a scratch on his forearm he couldn't explain and wine stains on his cuffs that he couldn't account for. The room itself was a small library on the ground floor of the Ashenmere estate, its walls lined with leather-bound books no one had read in decades, and its air heavy with the smell of old leather and dust. Elowin stood near the window with her arms crossed, refusing to look at him. Casimir stood by the door, his posture rigid, radiating hostility. Their respective advisors flanked them like seconds in a duel, and the air between the four of them was thick enough that a fifth person might have suffocated walking into it. Thyra was small, gray-haired, and utterly unbothered by the political powder keg she had walked into. She moved with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had seen things that would make kings weep and had long since stopped being impressed by anyone's title. She examined Casimir's wrist first, holding it up to the light and tracing the lines of the sigil with a fingertip that smelled faintly of dried herbs. She turned his arm slowly, studying the mark from every angle, muttering something under her breath that sounded like a language older than the kingdoms themselves. The silence in the room grew heavier with every second. Then she crossed the room and did the same to Elowin, whose jaw tightened but who held still. "Closer," Thyra said. "Absolutely not," Elowin replied. "Closer," Thyra repeated, "or I leave, and you both deal with this on your own." Casimir moved first, closing the distance between them until they stood 3 feet apart. The moment he did, both sigils flared with warmth. The dark lines brightened to a deep amber, pulsing gently, synchronized like two hearts beating in time. Elwyn inhaled sharply. Casimir felt it in his chest, a loosening, a settling, like a dislocated bone sliding back into place. Thyra watched the sigils with narrowed eyes. Now step apart. Casimir took 2 steps back. Pain hit immediately. Not the dull ache from that morning, but a sharp, searing burn that radiated from his wrist up through his forearm and into his shoulder. He heard Elwyn gasp and saw her clutch her own wrist, her face draining of color. Enough, Thyra said calmly. Come back. Casimir moved forward. The pain receded the moment the distance closed. They stood there, 3 feet apart, both breathing hard, both refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. Thyra turned to the advisors. The sigils are a soul bond, she said. Old magic, older than the Ashenmere Accord, older than the kingdoms themselves. It binds two wolves at the deepest level, spirit to spirit. Resisting it will cause increasing pain, disorientation, and eventually organ failure. The room went very still. But here's what concerns me, Thyra continued, her gaze sharpening. This bond is incomplete. It was initiated, but not sealed. Someone started this process deliberately, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. She looked between Casimir and Elwyn. This was not an accident. Someone bound you together on purpose. Elwyn's face had gone from pale to ashen. Casimir felt the floor tilt beneath him. Someone did this to us, Elwyn whispered. And for the first time since they had woken, her voice held no anger, only fear. The silence that followed was absolute. Casimir could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. Beside him, Oren had gone still in the way that trained soldiers go still when they realize the danger is worse than they thought. Oren stepped forward. Who would have access to this kind of magic? Thyra shook her head slowly. Very few. But whoever it was, they were at the festival last night. They were close enough to touch both the king and the queen. She paused, letting the weight of that settle over the room. And they are almost certainly still here. The neutral estate chosen for their confinement was called Thornfeld, a stone manor house on a forested ridge 2 hours' ride north of Ashenmere. It belonged to no kingdom, maintained by an old steward named Hadrick who asked no questions, served meals at precisely the same time each day, and whose discretion had been purchased with enough silver to buy a small village. The estate itself was modest by royal standards, 3 floors of gray stone, surrounded by overgrown gardens and dense pine forest. The nearest village was an hour's walk down a winding road. It was, in every sense, the middle of nowhere, which was precisely the point. The arrangement was simple in theory and miserable in practice. Casimir and Elwyn would remain within the estate grounds, close enough to keep the sigils dormant, while Thyra researched the bond's origins and searched for a way to sever it. Their courts would be told that both rulers had extended their stay at Ashenmere for continued negotiations. A diplomatic fiction thin enough to see through, but no one had a better option. They were given adjoining rooms connected by a single door that neither of them locked, because the one time Elwyn had turned the bolt in a moment of defiant independence, she had woken at 3 a.m. with her wrist burning so badly she'd bitten through her own lip to keep from screaming. The first 3 days were a masterwork of hostile silence. They took their meals at opposite ends of the same table because the dining room was the only space large enough to keep them within range while maintaining maximum distance. Elwyn read correspondence from Dusk Hollow. Casimir reviewed military dispatches from Valtheris. They did not speak. They did not make eye contact. They communicated exclusively through Oren and Marin, who served as reluctant intermediaries and were visibly losing patience with both of them. She wants the window open, Marin told Oren on the second morning. He wants it closed, Oren replied. They both looked at the window. Marin opened it halfway. Oren nodded. The king and queen, sitting 15 feet apart, pretended none of this was happening. But proximity has a way of eroding walls that stubbornness builds. On the third evening, Casimir noticed that Elwyn had not touched her dinner. The roasted pheasant and root vegetables sat untouched on her plate, while she stared at a letter from her capital, her jaw tight, her eyes too bright. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and set it aside with the kind of deliberate composure that people used when they were trying very hard not to fall apart. He said nothing. It was not his concern. An hour later, he passed the kitchens, and without quite deciding to, asked the cook to prepare a plate of honeyed bread and soft cheese, the kind of food that went down easy when nothing else would, and had it sent to her room without a note or explanation. The next morning, Elowyn appeared at breakfast looking slightly less hollow. She glanced at him once, quickly, then looked away. Neither of them mentioned the plate. On the fourth day, Casimir couldn't sleep. He paced the corridor outside their rooms in the dark, his boots echoing off the stone floors, his mind churning through military reports and border tensions and the slow, creeping fear that his kingdom was running without him and running poorly. He was a king who led from the front, who sat in council every morning and rode the borders every season. This enforced stillness was its own kind of torture. He turned a corner and found Elowyn sitting on the floor beneath a window, wrapped in a wool blanket, reading by moonlight. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked up at him with an expression that was less hostile than simply exhausted. The silver light carved her features into something softer than daylight ever allowed. They stared at each other. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "No." "The sigil?" "No. Just thinking." She nodded slowly, like she understood, and returned to her book. Casimir hesitated, then sat down against the opposite wall, stretching his legs out across the narrow corridor. They sat in silence for nearly an hour, not speaking, not acknowledging each other beyond the shared inability to rest. Outside, an owl called across the ridge, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. It was, against all logic, the most peaceful hour either of them had experienced since Ashenmere. On the fifth day, the first crack appeared in earnest. Casimir was reviewing a report from his eastern border, his brow furrowed, when Elowyn said from across the room, without looking up from her own correspondence, "Your commander at Greymarch is going to lose that garrison if he keeps splitting his forces to chase raiding parties." Casimir's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" "Greymarch," Elowyn repeated, still not looking at him. "The narrow valley approach from the north. Your patrols are spread too thin. Any competent tactician could see that." His first instinct was fury. She was reading his military reports. She was commenting on his military strategy. She was a rival queen offering unsolicited opinions about his kingdom's defense. His second instinct, arriving a beat too late to stop, was the uncomfortable recognition that she was right. "How do you know about Greymarch's terrain?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Elowyn turned a page. "Because I considered invading through it 2 years ago." The silence that followed was remarkable. "You're welcome," she added. Casimir opened his mouth, closed it, and returned to his report. He moved 2 companies to reinforce the northern approach that same afternoon. He did not thank her. But that evening, a pot of Valtharian black moss tea appeared outside her door, the kind that was nearly impossible to find outside his kingdom, and that she happened to drink every morning, a detail he had somehow absorbed without meaning to. The tea was gone by morning. Nothing was said. It was Marin who noticed it first. "They've stopped using us as intermediaries," she told Oren quietly, watching from the corridor as Casimir and Elowyn argued over a map of trade routes with the kind of passionate intensity that, in different circumstances, might have been mistaken for something else entirely. "Is that progress?" Oren asked. "I honestly have no idea," Marin replied. That night, Elowyn screamed. Casimir was out of bed, and through the connecting door before his conscious mind had finished processing the sound. He found her tangled in her sheets, thrashing, her face contorted in terror, her sigil blazing so brightly it cast amber light across the walls. He grabbed her shoulders. "Elowyn! Elowyn, wake up!" Her eyes flew open, wild and unseeing, and for a moment she looked straight through him. Then she was somewhere else. And so was he. The world had gone dark. Not the darkness of a room at night, but a consuming, breathing darkness that pressed against his skin like something alive. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and scorched earth. Beneath his feet, the ground was hot, almost burning, and in every direction there was nothing but flame-eaten ruins stretching to the horizon. Elowen stood beside him, her face illuminated by distant fires. She was staring at something ahead of them, something Casimir could not yet see but could feel, a presence vast and patient and ancient, watching them from behind the curtain of smoke. "What is this place?" he breathed. Elowen's hand found his in the dark, her fingers closing around his with a grip that trembled. "I don't know," she whispered, "but it knows we're here." The smoke parted, and in the distance, two kingdoms burned. Casimir recognized the towers of Valtherus. Elowen recognized the silver spires of Dusk Hollow. Both were being consumed, not by armies, not by war, but by something that moved beneath the flames like a living shadow. A voice came from everywhere and nowhere, low and ancient and utterly without mercy. The bond was not a curse. It was the only warning you will ever receive. Casimir jolted awake in Elowen's room, kneeling on the floor beside her bed, her hand still gripping his so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was awake too, sitting upright, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. They stared at each other in the gray pre-dawn light, the shared vision still burning behind their eyes. "You saw it," she whispered. "Both kingdoms," he managed, "burning." Elowen's grip on his hand tightened. "Something is coming, Casimir. Something is coming for both of us." The shared vision changed something between them, and neither could pretend it hadn't. They sat at opposite ends of the dining table the next morning as usual, but the silence was different. Not the cold, weaponized silence of before. This was the heavy quiet of two people processing the same impossible thing and not knowing what to say about it. Elowen broke first. "We need to talk about what we saw," she said, setting down her tea. Casimir looked up from the dispatch he had been pretending to read for the last 20 minutes. "We do." "Both kingdoms," Elowen said, "burning. Not from war. From something underneath. Something alive," Casimir agreed. And a voice that said the bond was a warning. Elowen's fingers traced the sigil on her wrist absently. A warning of what? They stared at each other across the long table, and for the first time since the festival, there was no hostility in it. Just the raw, uncomfortable recognition that they were standing on the same side of a problem neither understood. Thyra arrived that afternoon with a leather satchel full of old texts and an expression that suggested the news was not good. "The bond is destabilizing," she announced, setting her materials on the table between them. "Your resistance is putting strain on the connection. The sigils are holding, but the anchoring is weak." "What does that mean?" Casimir asked. "It means you need to stop fighting it," Thyra said plainly. "The bond requires proximity, real proximity, not opposite ends of a table, not separate rooms with a door between you. You need to be close consistently, or the sigils will start degrading." The implication settled over the room. "How close?" Elowen asked carefully. Thyra looked at her without blinking. "Same room, same space, ideally within arm's reach for the majority of the day and night." "Absolutely not," Elowen said. "Then the bond will fracture, and you'll both experience pain severe enough to make the last episode feel like a gentle warning," Thyra replied, unmoved. "Your choice." Casimir rubbed his jaw. Elowen stared at the wall. Oren and Marin exchanged a glance that communicated entire paragraphs without a single word. The arrangement shifted that evening. Elowen's belongings were moved into Casimir's room. A second bed was brought in and placed against the far wall, creating as much distance as the space allowed, which was not much. "This is temporary," Elowen said as she set her books on the small table near her bed. "Obviously," Casimir replied from across the room, where he was very deliberately not watching her unpin her hair. "The first night was agony, not because of pain, but because of awareness. Every sound she made, every rustle of sheets, every shift of her body carried across the space between them." Casimir lay rigid on his back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rhythm of her breathing and tried to think about military strategy. It didn't work. "You're not sleeping," Elowen said into the dark. "Neither are you." A long pause. I don't sleep well away from home, she admitted, and the confession was so unexpectedly small, so human, that it caught him off guard. How long have you been queen? He asked before he could stop himself. Another pause. Since I was 17. The number landed in the dark between them. 17. A girl, not a woman, crowned too soon. That's very young, he said carefully. I managed. Her voice was tight, clipped, the way it always got when she was holding something back. I didn't have a choice. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to know what had happened to the previous ruler, to her mother, to the kingdom that had forced a 17-year-old girl onto a throne she shouldn't have needed yet. But something in her tone warned him away from it, a wound too fresh even after all these years. I was 21, he offered instead, when I took the throne, and I was terrible at it. The silence that followed felt different. Surprised. You were terrible? Elowen repeated. Spectacularly. I made every mistake a young king could make. Trusted the wrong advisors, ignored the right ones, made decisions based on pride instead of judgment. He exhaled. Cost people things I can never give back. He hadn't meant to say that much. The words had come out like something loosened by the dark, by her nearness, by the strange intimacy of lying in the same room and speaking without seeing each other's faces. Elowen was quiet for a long time. My mother was queen before me, she said finally. She was a good ruler, patient, strategic. Everything I'm not. You sell yourself short. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you identified a critical vulnerability in my eastern defense in under 30 seconds, Casimir said. Your mother trained you well. He heard her breath catch. The sound was so quiet he almost missed it. Thank you, she whispered, and her voice was thick. They fell asleep without deciding to, their conversation trailing off into drowsy half-sentences and then silence, and then the deep, steady breathing of genuine rest. The sigils on their wrists pulsed gently in the dark, warm and steady, synchronized like twin heartbeats. In the days that followed, the walls came down in increments. Not all at once, not dramatically. It was small things, accumulated like snowfall, each one insignificant on its own, but together, adding up to something that neither of them could ignore. She discovered he drank his tea scalding hot and couldn't stand it lukewarm. He discovered she hummed when she was concentrating, a low, tuneless sound she didn't seem aware of. She found out he wrote letters to his younger sister every week without fail, and that his handwriting was surprisingly elegant for a man with hands that large. He found out she kept a dried sprig of mountain sage in her pocket at all times, a childhood habit she'd never outgrown, and that she talked in her sleep, mostly nonsense, but once she murmured the word mama, so softly it made his chest ache. She discovered he was afraid of spiders, a fact she found so absurd she nearly laughed out loud when a small one descended from the ceiling and the Alpha King of Valtherus flinched away from it like it was an assassin. He discovered she couldn't swim, a significant vulnerability for the queen of a kingdom bordered by rivers, and when he offered to teach her someday, the word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address. They argued constantly, but the arguments had shifted. No longer designed to wound, they had become something else entirely. Spirited, passionate, almost enjoyable. They argued about everything. Border policy, agricultural subsidies, whether the northern trade route should run through Greymarch or around it, and Casimir found himself looking forward to it, to the sharp intelligence behind her positions, to the way her eyes lit up when she found a flaw in his logic. Your tariff policy on river trade is economically suicidal, Elowen told him over dinner on the 7th evening. Your kingdom's reliance on a single grain export is a catastrophe waiting to happen, he fired back. At least my people can afford bread. At least mine can afford ambition. They glared at each other across the table. Marin and Oren, seated nearby, had stopped pretending to eat. Your tax structure is elegant, though, Casimir added grudgingly. Elowen paused mid-retort. Did you just compliment me? I complimented your treasury. Don't flatter yourself. Something flickered across her face. The corner of her mouth twitched, and she looked down at her plate quickly, but not before he caught it. Not before his chest did that thing again, the thing it had absolutely no business doing. That night, the distance between their beds felt smaller. Elowen's voice came softly through the dark. Tell me about the mistakes. What? You said you made decisions based on pride. That you cost people things you could never give back. She paused. What did you mean? His body went rigid beneath the sheets. The question landed in the dark between them like a blade, and everything in him wanted to deflect, to shut it down, to keep the door closed on the worst thing he had ever done. It's late, he said. Casimir. The way she said his name, without title, without formality, just the sound of it in her voice, undid something in him. There was a peace summit, he began, and the words came out rough, pulled from somewhere deep. Years ago, early in my reign, Dusk Hollow proposed talks. An envoy came to Valtheris with an offer of negotiation. Elowen had gone very still. My advisors called it a trap, said Dusk Hollow couldn't be trusted. I was young and proud and afraid of looking weak, so I listened to them. He swallowed hard. I turned the envoy away. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. Heavier, colder. 3 weeks later, the border erupted. He continued. People died. Good people. On both sides. And it was my fault. Because I had a chance to choose peace and I chose pride instead. He waited for her response. The anger. The accusation. The confirmation that he was everything she had always believed him to be. Instead, Elowen's voice came back small and strange. The envoy, she said. Do you remember who it was? Something in her tone made his blood run cold. A woman, he said slowly. Tall, dark hair. She carried herself like royalty. The silence stretched so long he thought she had fallen asleep. Then he heard her breathing change, heard the ragged edge of it, and understood. Elowen. She didn't answer. He heard her turn away from him in the dark, heard the sharp intake of breath that she was trying to swallow, and the sound cracked something open in his chest. The envoy, Elowen said, and her voice was barely holding together, was my mother. The morning came without mercy. Casimir opened his eyes to gray light and the immediate, crushing weight of what had been spoken in the dark. He turned his head toward Elowen's bed. It was empty. The sheets were pulled back, her boots were gone, and the door to the corridor stood open. He found her in the estate's overgrown garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath a yew tree that had grown wild and tangled in its neglect. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her face was composed, but her eyes were red. She heard him approach and stiffened. Don't, she said quietly. Casimir stopped 6 feet away, close enough for the sigils but far enough to give her the distance her voice demanded. I need to tell you the rest, he said. I don't want to hear the rest. You deserve to. Elowen looked at him then, and the expression on her face was not the fury he had expected. It was something worse. It was grief, old and deep and reawakened. My mother rode to Valtheris alone, Elowen said, her voice steady but brittle. She believed that if she went in person, as queen, it would demonstrate good faith. She told me she would be home in a week. Her jaw tightened. She came home in a box. The words hit Casimir like a physical blow. The border conflict killed her, he said, his throat raw. The one that started because I refused to negotiate. The skirmish at Ashenford Bridge. Elowen confirmed. She was traveling home through the border region when it erupted. Her escort was overwhelmed. She was killed by wolves wearing Valtheris colors. Casimir's knees almost buckled. He had known about the failed summit. He had known about the border deaths. He had carried that guilt for years, a constant weight behind his ribs. But he had never known who the envoy was. His advisors had handled the details. A delegation from Dusk Hollow, they had told him, turned away as instructed. He had never asked for names. I didn't know, he said, and the words sounded pathetically small. I swear to you, I didn't know she was the queen. Would it have mattered? Elowen asked. The question pierced him because he wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that if he had known it was a queen standing at his gates, a mother who had ridden alone to beg for peace, he would have made a different choice. But he had been 21 and full of arrogance, and the truth was uglier than the comfort. I don't know, he admitted. And that is the worst part. Elowyn looked away. Her fingers gripped the edge of the stone bench, knuckles bloodless. He could feel her pain even without trying, a deep, tidal thing that she had been carrying since she was crowned, and the knowledge that he had caused it was almost more than he could bear. I am sorry, Casimir said. I know that changes nothing. I know words don't bring her back. But I am sorry, Elowyn. I have been sorry every day since. She didn't respond. After a long time, she stood and walked past him back toward the manor without a word. The day passed in silence so thick it was hard to breathe through. Elowyn stayed in their shared room. Casimir stayed in the corridor outside, close enough for the sigils, far enough that she wouldn't have to see his face. Thyra found him there in the late afternoon, sitting against the wall with his head in his hands. Problems? She asked mildly. She knows, Casimir said without looking up. About the summit, about her mother. Thyra lowered herself onto a wooden chair near the corridor window and studied him for a moment. Ah, she said. How did she find out? I told her. And now she won't speak to you. Can you blame her? Thyra didn't answer that. Instead, she opened the worn leather satchel she carried everywhere and pulled out a bound manuscript so old the pages had gone, the color of weak tea. I found something, she said. About the bond, about the visions, and about what's coming. She laid the manuscript on her knee and turned the pages carefully. There are records in the old archives at Ashenmere, scattered, incomplete, but they tell a story if you read them together. Casimir lifted his head. Centuries ago, before the wolf kingdoms divided, there was a single entity that ruled the deep places beneath the earth, Thyra continued. The old texts call it the Ashborn. Not a creature exactly, more like a living hunger. It feeds on division, on hatred, on the space between people who should be united but aren't. A chill crawled down Casimir's spine. It was driven into dormancy by the first wolf kings. Thyra went on, who bound their kingdoms together through blood and oath and kept it sleeping through unity. But over the centuries, the kingdoms fractured, old alliances rotted, rivalries festered. She looked at him pointedly. The hatred between Valtheris and Duskhollow has been particularly nourishing. You're saying we fed this thing, Casimir said. For 3 generations, Thyra confirmed. And now it's waking up. The room felt colder. Casimir thought of the visions, both kingdoms burning, the shadow moving beneath the flames like something alive, and felt sick. The bond, he said slowly. Someone knew. Thyra nodded. Whoever bound you at the festival wasn't attacking you. They were trying to save you. The soul bond is the oldest magic the wolves possess. It's the same bond the first kings used to keep the Ashborn dormant. 2 rulers, joined at the spirit, their unity strong enough to hold the darkness down. Who cast it? I don't know yet, but they knew what they were doing, and they knew time was running out. Thyra closed the manuscript. The Ashborn is already stirring. Reports have been coming from the border for weeks. Villages gone quiet, livestock found dead without a mark on them, entire forests going silent overnight, no birds, no insects, nothing. I've seen those reports, Casimir said, his stomach tightening. I assumed it was territorial predators. It's not, Thyra met his eyes. It's the Ashborn testing the edges of its prison. Every year that Valtheris and Duskhollow have spent at each other's throats has weakened the old bindings, and now the walls are almost gone. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like armor he would never be allowed to remove. Tell Elowyn, he said quietly. She needs to know. Thyra shook her head. You tell her. She won't listen to me. Then make her listen, Thyra replied, standing. Because if the Ashborn rises fully, your guilt and her grief won't matter. Neither of your kingdoms will exist long enough for either of you to feel anything at all. She left him alone in the corridor. Casimir sat there as the light faded, the manuscript heavy in his hands, and tried to find the courage to walk through a door he wasn't sure would open for him. That evening, he knocked on the connecting door. 3 quiet taps. No response. Elowyn, please. Silence. Something is coming for our kingdoms. Both of them. Thyra has found records. I need you to hear this. More silence. Then the scrape of a chair. footsteps, and the door opened. Elowyn stood in the doorway, her face composed and distant, a mask of queenly control that betrayed nothing. "Talk," she said. He told her everything. The Ashbourne, the old bindings, the first wolf kings, the centuries of feeding it through division, the waking signs at the border. Elowyn listened without expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So we've been poisoning the earth with our hatred," she said flatly, "and now the poison has teeth." Essentially, she leaned against the doorframe and studied the sigil on her wrist. "And the bond is meant to stop it, if we let it." Her gaze came up to meet his, and the raw complexity in it made his chest ache. He could feel her even without the bond flaring, the fear, the anger, the grief, and beneath it all, the pull, the traitorous, undeniable pull toward him that she was fighting with everything she had. "I need time," she said. "We may not have much." "I know." She looked at him, and something fragile moved behind her eyes. "But I can't just forget what you did, Casimir, even if the world is ending." She closed the door. That night, a rider arrived from the eastern border with a dispatch bearing Oren's emergency seal. 3 villages along the Valtheris Dusk Hollow frontier had gone silent in the last 48 hours. Scouts sent to investigate had not returned. Elowyn did not close herself off entirely. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, she gave him exactly what the bond required and nothing more. She stayed in the shared room. She sat within range during meals. She participated in strategy discussions about the border reports with the detached precision of a woman negotiating a trade agreement with a stranger. She was present, and she was gone. Casimir felt the withdrawal like a slow bleed. Not the sharp, searing pain of physical separation, but something deeper and more insidious. A coldness that crept into the connection where warmth had started to grow. A door that had been inching open was now closed, locked, barred from the inside. He didn't fight it. He had no right to. "She has every reason to despise you," he told himself as he sat through another meal of oppressive silence. "You turned away her mother. You broke her family. You are the reason she was crowned at 17. The guilt was not new. He had carried it for years, a familiar passenger that rode behind his ribs and whispered at night. But before, it had been abstract, a failed summit, a border conflict, nameless casualties in a cycle of violence that predated his reign. Now it had a face, a name, a daughter who sat across from him every day and looked through him like glass. On the 3rd day of her withdrawal, Thyra examined their sigils and went quiet. "What?" Casimir asked. "The sigils are darkening," Thyra said carefully. "The bond is still intact, but the anchoring is weakening. Physical proximity isn't enough on its own. The bond needs emotional resonance to sustain itself." "Meaning what?" Thyra looked at him with an expression that managed to be both clinical and pitying. "Meaning that 2 people who share a soul bond cannot survive indefinitely on polite distance. The bond feeds on connection. Without it, the sigils will decay." "How long?" he asked. "Weeks. Perhaps less, given how much strain the bond has already absorbed." Casimir felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And when the sigils decay completely?" Thyra didn't answer immediately. She packed her instruments into her satchel with careful, deliberate movements. "The bond will fracture. The backlash will damage both of your spirits beyond repair. At best, you'll lose your wolves entirely. At worst," she paused, "organ failure, within days of fracture." Casimir stared at her. "You're saying we'll die?" "I'm saying you're both choosing to die rather than face each other honestly, and I find it profoundly frustrating." Thyra's composure cracked for the first time since he had known her, and the anger in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "She is grieving, and she has every right to. You are drowning in guilt, and you have reason to. But neither of those things will matter when the Ashbourne rises, and there is no bond strong enough to hold it back." She left. Casimir sat alone and felt the weight of it press him flat. He tried. In the days that followed, he tried in every way he could think of that didn't involve words, because words were what had broken everything in the first place. He brought her reports from the border, shared intelligence about troop movements, deferred to her judgment on defensive strategy. He left fresh black moss tea outside their door each morning, though she never acknowledged it. He arranged for Marin to receive secure dispatches from Dusk Hollow so that Elowyn could stay informed about her kingdom, knowing that the helplessness of ruling from a distance was eating at her the same way it ate at him. He was careful, respectful, professional. He gave her no reason for complaint and no opening for connection. Elowyn accepted his information and gave nothing back. Her responses were measured, precise, and empty. She answered questions in as few words as possible. She did not use his name. She did not look at him longer than necessity demanded. When their hands brushed accidentally over a map, she pulled back as if burned, and the flash of something raw in her eyes before she shuddered, it made the ache in his chest worse, and the sigils continued to darken. Meanwhile, the border reports grew worse with each passing day. A fifth village had gone dark. A sixth followed within hours, this one deeper inside Dusk Hollow territory than any before. A supply caravan traveling the eastern road had vanished without a trace, its wagons found days later with the horses still in harness, untouched, but every person gone. Not a drop of blood. Not a single sign of struggle, just absence, as if the people had been gently erased from existence. Orin scouts returned from the frontier with haunted faces, reporting a silence so complete it rang in your ears like a sound of its own. One scout, a veteran of 20 years, refused to go back. He said the darkness at the border moved, not like shadow, not like cloud, but like something breathing. The grass near the frontier had started turning gray, not dead, not dry, just drained of something essential, as if the color itself was being consumed, and the gray was spreading. Orin cornered Casimir on the fifth day in the corridor outside the strategy room. The beta blocked his path and stood there with his arms crossed, immovable as stone. "You look terrible," he said flatly. "Thank you. I'm serious. You've lost weight. Your hands are shaking. I watched you try to read a dispatch this morning and you couldn't focus long enough to finish a paragraph. You went over the same page 3 times without absorbing a word." Orin's voice was low and urgent. "This is killing you, and pretending otherwise doesn't make it noble. It makes it reckless. I'm fine. You are not fine, and neither is she." Casimir looked up sharply. Orin's jaw was tight. "Marin told me. The queen collapsed in her room yesterday. Briefly, but she collapsed. Her sigil went dark for nearly a full minute before it came back." Marin is terrified. The ground tilted beneath Casimir's feet. "She collapsed? And she won't tell you because she doesn't want you anywhere near her right now." Orin stepped closer. "But I'm telling you because this isn't just about you and her anymore. If you both die, Valtherus loses its king and Dusk Hollow loses its queen, and the Ashbourne wins without having to lift a finger. Your kingdoms will tear themselves apart fighting over empty thrones while the real enemy walks through the front door." Casimir pressed his palms against the table and tried to steady himself. The shaking in his hands had gotten worse. "She can't forgive me, Orin, and I can't blame her." "Then find a way to earn it," Orin said. "Because the alternative is 2 empty thrones, and whatever crawls out of the dark to sit on them." Across the estate, Marin was having an equally futile conversation with her queen. Elowyn sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl, looking thinner than she had a week ago. The circles beneath her eyes were deepening into bruises. Her sigil had gone from amber to the color of old iron. She held a cup of tea in both hands, but she wasn't drinking it. She just held it, like the warmth was the only thing keeping her tethered. Her hands trembled slightly, a tremor she would have hidden a week ago but no longer had the strength to disguise. The shawl around her shoulders was one of Casimir's, Marin noticed, pulled from the back of a chair in the shared room. Elowyn probably didn't even realize she'd taken it, the bond reaching for him even when she wouldn't. "You need to talk to him," Marin said. "I have nothing to say to him." "You have everything to say to him. You're just too stubborn and too hurt to say it." Marin knelt beside her chair, her voice fierce and gentle in equal measure. "Elowyn, I watched your mother ride out of Dusk Hollow that day. I was 14 years old. I remember the look on her face. She was hopeful. She believed peace was possible. Elowen's jaw clenched. And when she didn't come back, Marin continued, I watched you pick up a crown that was too heavy for a girl your age and carry it without complaint for nearly a decade. I have never once questioned your strength. She paused. But you're using it wrong now. He turned her away. Marin. He did. And it was wrong. And he knows it. I've watched him carry the weight of it across his face every single day we've been here. Marin took Elowen's hand. Your mother wanted peace. That was the whole point of the summit. She didn't ride to Valtharis so that her daughter could choose to die, rather than forgive a man who made a terrible mistake when he was barely older than you were when you lost her. Elowen's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or sobs, but with a shudder that passed through her whole body like a wave, and the way her fingers tightened around Marin's hand told the truth her face was trying to hide. I'm not ready, she whispered. I know, Marin said. But the bond doesn't care about ready, and neither does the thing that's eating your border. That evening, the sigil on Casimir's wrist went dark during a strategy meeting. He was standing at the table, pointing to a position on the border map where the latest silence had been reported, when the pain hit. Not the gradual ache he had grown accustomed to, but a sudden, blinding agony that started in his wrist and detonated through his entire body. His vision went white. His knees buckled. He caught the edge of the table and missed, and the stone floor came up to meet him with a crack that echoed through the room. Oren was beside him instantly. Marin was already running for Elowen's room. When Elowen arrived, Casimir was unconscious on the floor, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and wrong. The sigil on his wrist was completely dark. No light, no warmth, just dead black lines on gray skin. She dropped beside him before she could think, before she could remember that she was supposed to be angry, before the walls she had spent a week rebuilding could stop her. Her hands found his face. His skin was cold. Casimir, she said, and his name tore out of her like something that had been caged. Casimir, open your eyes. Nothing. Thyra appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and spoke with the careful calm of a healer delivering the worst possible news. The bond is dying, she said. The emotional starvation has pushed it past the threshold. If the connection isn't restored in the next few days, the bond will fracture completely. Elowen looked up at her, Casimir's head cradled in her lap, her fingers tangled in his hair. And when it fractures? She asked, though she already knew. Thyra met her eyes. He dies. And then, because the bond runs both ways, you follow. Elowen looked down at the man in her arms. The man whose arrogance had cost her mother's life and her childhood. The man who brought her tea without being asked and complimented her treasury when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and carried his guilt like a millstone around his neck because he believed he deserved to suffer. She bent down and touched her forehead to his temple, closing her eyes. Don't you dare, she whispered against his skin. Don't you dare leave me with this unfinished. We are not done, Casimir. Do you hear me? We are not done. The sigil on her wrist flickered once, faintly, like the last ember in a dying fire. Casimir surfaced slowly, like a man dragging himself up from the bottom of a black river. The first thing he registered was warmth. Not the cold, hollow emptiness that had been spreading through his chest for days, but genuine heat against his skin. Someone's hand in his hair, someone's heartbeat beneath his ear. The second thing he registered was her scent. Rain-soaked wildflowers and mountain sage, close, everywhere. He opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor of the strategy room, his head in Elowen's lap. Her fingers were threaded through his hair, and her other hand was pressed flat against his chest, directly over his heart, as if she could hold it beating through sheer force of will. Her eyes were closed. Tears had dried in silver tracks down her cheeks. The sigil on his wrist was glowing faintly. Not the bright amber of before, but a dim, fragile pulse, like a candle flame cupped against the wind. Elowen, he said, and his voice came out wrecked. Her eyes opened. The relief that flooded her face was so raw, so enormous, that it stripped away every defense she had spent the last week constructing. She made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and leaned her cheek against his forehead. You stopped breathing, she whispered. For almost a full minute, you stopped breathing. I'm here. You were gone. Her fingers tightened in his hair. Do you understand? You were gone, and I couldn't feel you at all, and it was like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out something I didn't even know was there. Casimir lifted his hand, slowly because everything ached, and touched her face. His thumb traced the dried path of a tear. She didn't pull away. I thought I was protecting you, he said. By accepting the distance, by letting you hate me. I don't hate you. The words came out fierce and broken. That's the problem, Casimir. I have spent all these years hating you, and then you had to go and leave food outside my door when I couldn't eat, and brew tea you had no reason to know I liked, and tell me my mother trained me well. Her voice cracked. And then you told me the truth about the summit when you could have hidden it, and I wanted to hate you for that too, but all I could feel was how much it destroyed you to say it. She pulled back far enough to look at him, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen before. Not anger, not grief. Something that had been forged in the space between the two. My mother rode to Valtheris because she believed that enemies could become something else, Elowin said. She believed that the gap between hatred and peace was smaller than everyone thought. She died for that belief. She swallowed hard. And I have spent nearly a decade proving her wrong by hating you, by refusing to see anything in Valtheris except the kingdom that took her from me. You had every right. Maybe, but she wouldn't have wanted it. Elowin's eyes filled again. She would have wanted exactly this, 2 wolves from 2 kingdoms, sitting in the wreckage of their pride, choosing something other than war. The words settled over him like a hand on a wound. I can't undo what happened, Casimir said. I can't bring her back. If I could trade my life for that day, for the chance to open those gates and welcome her inside, I would do it without hesitation. I know, Elowin said softly. I can feel it. That's what makes this so impossible and so undeniable. She helped him sit up. They faced each other on the cold stone floor, close enough that the sigils pulsed in tandem, and for the first time since the festival, there was nothing between them. No hostility, no pretense, no armor. The bond is dying, Elowin said. Thyra says we have days. I know. And the Ashborn is waking. I know that too. So we have a choice, she continued, and her voice steadied, the queen emerging through the woman. We can keep circling each other's wounds until the bond breaks and we both die, and our kingdoms fall to something that's been feeding on our hatred for generations. Or we can do what my mother tried to do all those years ago. She held out her hand, palm up, the sigil dark against her skin. We can choose peace. Casimir looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face. The tears, the resolve, the terrifying, breathtaking courage of a woman offering trust to the person who had given her every reason to withhold it. He took her hand. The contact was immediate and overwhelming. The sigils flared, not the dim pulse of survival, but a deep, radiant gold that cast their shadows against the walls. Warmth flooded through the connection, not gentle but torrential, a dam breaking after weeks of pressure. He felt her, truly felt her, for the first time. Not fragments through a failing link, but the full depth of who she was. Her grief, a vast and tender thing she had carried alone since she was 17. Her strength, built on loneliness and stubbornness and the refusal to let her mother's sacrifice be meaningless. Her fear, not of him, but of wanting something she might lose. And beneath it all, burning steadily like a coal that had never gone out, a pull toward him so powerful it terrified her. And she felt him. His guilt, not the abstract weight he described, but the lived reality of it, the sleepless nights, the faces of the dead he had memorized, the young king who had made a terrible choice and spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of undoing it. His loneliness, masked by duty, his wonder at her, the way her mind worked, the way she argued, the way she had looked at him in the corridor that night with her hair down and moonlight on her face. Oh, Elowin breathed, and the sound was small and stunned and full of recognition. Casimir lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against the sigil on her wrist. The mark blazed golden beneath his kiss. Elowin's free hand came up to the back of his neck and pulled him toward her. The kiss was not gentle. It was years of hatred and 1 month of denial and the desperate, aching relief of two people who had almost lost each other before they had the chance to begin. She kissed him like she was angry about wanting to, and he kissed her back like he was terrified she might change her mind. He pulled her closer, and she came willingly, her hands gripping his shoulders, her forehead pressed against his. The bond roared between them, golden and fierce, demanding more closeness, more surrender. "Stay," she whispered against his mouth. "Stay, and don't let go." He carried her through the corridor and up the stairs and into their room, and when the door closed behind them, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only her, only him. Only the bond blazing between them like a second sun, flooding every corner of the room with golden warmth. What followed was not something language could hold. It was the bond completing itself. Two spirits that had been circling each other for weeks, finally colliding with a force that rewrote them both. Every wall they had built, every defense they had carried, every year of hatred and distance, all of it burned away in the golden light that poured through the connection. She felt his heart as if it were her own. He felt hers, as if he had been born carrying it. The mating bond snapped into place at the moment of deepest surrender, and it shook them both to the marrow. Casimir felt it settle in his chest like a second heartbeat, golden and unbreakable. A permanent, living tether that would hold for the rest of their lives and beyond, woven into the very fabric of their spirits. The sigils on their wrists blazed so brightly the room turned to liquid gold, and for a single breathtaking moment, they could feel the old bindings across the border responding, strengthening, answering the call of a bond that hadn't been forged in centuries. They lay together afterward, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her like he intended to hold her for the rest of his life. The bond hummed between them, warm and complete, a living thing that pulsed with every shared heartbeat. "So that's what it feels like," Elowin murmured. "What?" "Peace." Casimir pressed his lips to the top of her head and felt something he hadn't felt in years, something he had almost forgotten the shape of. Hope. They drifted into sleep together, her body curved against his hand resting over the place where her heart beat steady and sure. For the first time since the festival, there was no pain, no distance, no cold. Elowin opened her eyes to darkness, not the darkness of their room, with its banked fire and silver moonlight, a breathing darkness, a living darkness. The air reeked of scorched earth and something older, something that smelled like the absence of every good thing that had ever existed. She was standing in a vast, empty plain, and the ground beneath her feet was made of ash. "Casimir," she called into the void, and her voice came back to her swallowed and wrong. His hand found hers in the dark. He was beside her, his grip iron tight, his face illuminated by the faint golden glow of their sigils, the only light in a world that had forgotten what light was. "It's here," he said, and the Ashborn opened its eyes. It did not have a form, not exactly. It was the darkness itself, gathered and condensed and given awareness. It rose from the ash like a tide, shapeless and enormous, and the weight of its attention settled over them like a mountain placed on their shoulders. The air grew colder. The golden light of their sigils dimmed, pushed back by a presence that was older than language, older than memory, older than the kingdoms it had been feeding on. Elowin's knees nearly buckled. Beside her, Casimir staggered but held. His hand found hers and gripped tight, and she gripped back, and between them the bond held steady even as everything else trembled. The Ashborn did not speak in words. It spoke in feeling, in memory, in the language of wounds that had never healed, and it knew them. It knew them intimately, because it had been feeding on them for years. Every barbed word at the Ashenmere feasts, every diplomatic insult, every night Elowin had lain awake hating the king of Valtherus, every morning Casimir had woken carrying guilt he couldn't name. The Ashborn had tasted all of it, and now it was hungry for more. The plain shifted. Suddenly they were standing in the great hall of Valtheris, and a young man sat on the throne with an expression of terrified arrogance that he was too proud to let anyone see. Advisors surrounded him, voices overlapping, urgent, persuasive, and at the gate, visible through the tall windows, a woman waited alone, a white banner of peace clutched in her hands. Elowen's breath left her body. "Mama," she whispered. The young Casimir on the throne turned to his chief advisor. The advisor shook his head. The gates remained closed. The woman outside waited for an hour, then two, then lowered the banner slowly, her face crumbling with the quiet devastation of someone who had believed in something that wasn't there. Elowen watched her mother turn away from Valtheris, and the grief hit her so hard she doubled over. "Yes," the Ashbourne seemed to say without speaking, its satisfaction radiating through the dark like heat from a furnace. "Remember, this is what he is. This is what he chose." The scene shifted again. Ashenford Bridge. Chaos. Wolves in Valtheris colors clashing with a Dusk Hollow escort. And in the middle of it, a queen who should never have been there, caught in violence she had tried to prevent. Elowen watched her mother fall, watched the white banner stain red beneath her. The scream that tore from Elowen's throat was not a sound but a rupture, something breaking open that she had kept sealed since she was 17 years old. Casimir caught her before she hit the ground. He pulled her against his chest and held her while the Ashbourne played the worst moment of her life on an endless, terrible loop. "Let her go," he snarled into the dark. "Show me instead. I'm the one who made the choice. Show me." The Ashbourne obliged. The scene reformed, and now Casimir was watching himself, the young king who had been too afraid to look weak, the advisor's voice in his ear, the gate closing. And then the reports coming in, 3 weeks later. Body counts written in neat columns, and one name at the top of the list that his advisors had carefully omitted from his briefing. Queen Iselda Cale of Dusk Hollow, killed at Ashenford Bridge. Casimir watched his younger self read the full report for the first time, watched the color drain from his face, watched his hands begin to shake. He felt the guilt hit fresh, as raw and devastating as the day he had first learned the truth. "Yes," the Ashbourne pressed, its hunger growing. "You are the architect of her grief. You are the reason she was alone. You are the reason her mother died, and her childhood ended, and her kingdom suffered. No bond can erase that. No kiss can undo it. You are poison, and everything you touch will burn." Casimir's grip on Elowen loosened. She felt him pulling away, not physically but spiritually, the bond dimming as the guilt consumed him from the inside out. The same pattern, the same surrender. The Ashbourne didn't need to overpower them. It just needed them to agree with it. "No," Elowen said. She pulled back and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were glazed, distant, sinking into the same black water she had felt pulling at him for weeks. "Look at me," she commanded. "Casimir, look at me." His eyes focused slowly, painfully. "It's telling you what you already believe," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "That you're the villain, that you deserve this. That's why it's so effective, because you've been saying it to yourself since the day you read that report." The Ashbourne shifted around them, pressing closer, its hunger sharpening. "I spent just as long saying the same things about myself," Elowen continued, tears streaming down her face. "That I wasn't enough, that a better daughter would have stopped her mother from riding out alone. That a stronger queen would have avenged her instead of sitting on a throne and swallowing her grief and pretending she was fine." Her voice broke. "I have been so angry at you because it was easier than being angry at myself." Casimir stared at her, and she felt his shock, his recognition, the terrible mirror of her words reflecting his own hidden truth back at him. "My mother believed that the distance between enemies was smaller than anyone imagined," Elowen said. "She was right. I'm standing in front of the man I've hated for most of my life, and the distance between us is nothing." She leaned her forehead against his. "It was always nothing." The Ashbourne roared. The sound was not audible but felt, a vibration in the marrow, a fury at something slipping through its grasp. The visions shattered around them. Ashenford Bridge dissolved, the throne room crumbled. The Ashbourne threw everything it had at them, every death, every failure, every moment of guilt and grief and loneliness from both their lives, hurling it like weapons. Elowyn held on. "You made a terrible choice," she said to Casimir, her voice steady now, anchored by something deeper than forgiveness. "And I have grieved my mother every day since. Those things are both true, and they will always be true." She took his hand and pressed it against her chest, over her heart, where the bond pulsed gold between them. "But this is also true," she said, "and I am choosing this." Casimir's hand trembled against her heart. Then his fingers spread wide, pressing firm, and she felt the shift in him. Not the guilt disappearing, it would never fully disappear, but the grip of it loosening, the drowning man choosing to kick toward the surface instead of sinking. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were not the polished apology of a king, but the raw, broken offering of a man who meant them with every fractured piece of himself. "For your mother, for your childhood, for every year you spent carrying a weight I put on your shoulders. I know," she said. "I forgive you." The words were simple, 3 syllables, but they detonated across the bond like sunlight through black water, and the Ashbourne screamed. The golden light from their sigils erupted outward, not gently but violently, tearing through the darkness like fire through paper. The ash beneath their feet turned to solid earth. The smoke dissolved. The visions of death and failure burned away in the radiance of two wolves who had chosen, despite everything, despite history and grief and pride and all those years of war, to stand together. The Ashbourne recoiled, its vastness contracted, its presence diminishing like a tide pulling back from shore. The old bindings reformed in its wake, golden threads weaving through the earth, stitching the prison closed with a strength it hadn't known in generations. Not dead, not destroyed, but driven back, locked down, starved of the hatred that had sustained it. The darkness fractured, and light poured through. Elowyn woke in Casimir's arms, in their bed, in the warm amber glow of a fire that had burned down to embers. Morning light was creeping through the curtains, pale gold and impossibly gentle. Casimir was already awake, looking down at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Unguarded, tender, wet-eyed and smiling. "It's gone," he said quietly. Elowyn pressed her hand against his chest, felt the steady, strong beat of his heart, felt the bond between them humming with warmth and life, and smiled back. "Not gone," she corrected softly. "Held." He kissed her forehead, her nose, the corner of her mouth. She curled into him and let her eyes close. For the first time in nearly a decade, neither of them was carrying the weight alone. The Ashbourne did not die. Ancient things rarely did. But the renewed bond between Valtheris and Duskalo drove it deep, deeper than it had been in centuries, and the border villages went quiet for the right reasons again. Birds returned, livestock grazed without incident. The forests remembered how to breathe. The political aftermath was, predictably, a disaster. An alliance between the two rival kingdoms was shocking enough. A mating bond between their rulers was unprecedented. Courtiers on both sides reacted with outrage, suspicion, and the particular flavor of indignation that powerful people reserved for events they had not been consulted about. Casimir addressed the Valtheris court with Elowyn standing beside him, her hand in his, the mating mark visible on both their throats. "If anyone wishes to challenge the bond," he said calmly, "they are welcome to take it up with both of us." No one did. Elowyn's court was harder. Duskalo had grieved Queen Iselda for years, and the idea of their current queen bonded to the king whose arrogance had contributed to her mother's death was a wound that would not heal quickly. "Give them time," Marin counseled. "And if time isn't enough?" Elowyn asked. Marin smiled. "Then give them results. Peace is hard to argue with." The cure was never found because there was nothing to cure. Thyra confirmed what they had already come to understand. The bond had not been a trap. It had been a gift, offered by someone who had seen the Ashbourne stirring and made the desperate, brilliant choice to bind the only two people capable of stopping it. They never discovered who cast the sigils at the festival. Thyra had her suspicions. something about a healer who had been living quietly in a lake village for decades and who knew things about old magic that most wolves had forgotten. But when Elowen raised an eyebrow at her, the old woman simply smiled and changed the subject. Months later, on the anniversary of the Ashenmere Accord, Casimir woke slowly to morning light in a room that smelled of mountain sage and wildflowers. Elowen was still asleep beside him, her head on his chest, her hand resting over his heart. The sigils on their wrists pulsed gently in the quiet, warm and golden and perfectly synchronized. He watched her for a moment, the peace on her face, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers curled against his skin even in sleep, like she was holding on to something she had no intention of ever letting go. Then he closed his eyes, settled deeper into the warmth of her, and slept.